Hello and welcome back to Speed Model. Last time we basically finished up the cubicle room, so now we're gonna move on to another room in the office. I have picked the second studio, and the whole idea for that room is that we're gonna have some kind of a lounge. Of course, this lounge is actually a set where we can do, say, podcasts or video games, things like that. So, running with this idea in mind, let's see what we create. We turn our attention to the other studio now, and the first thing I do is to duplicate the sofa over from the pantry. I tweak its color so it's now blue, position it to my liking and duplicate it. The idea is that we now want two single seaters at the sides. It takes a bit of finagling before I figure out the best way to shrink the 3-seater down to a 1-seater, but I eventually achieve this by keeping just half of the left side and using the mirror modifier to bring the mesh back together. I duplicate the seat over and take some time to scoot everything into place. Then it's time for a little coffee table. Once again, this comes from the pantry, though I make it a little bit wider to suit the layout of the room. With everything in place, I bring in my scale characters, and they prove to me that the scale of everything is just right. Next up, I copy over a monitor from the cubicle room. Zooming in, I get rid of its base, scale it up, and position it against the wall as a wall-mounted TV. I tweak the back of it a little, extruding it and attaching it to the wall to complete the wall-mounted look. With that done, I create a little TV console, using my scale figure to give me a good idea of the height. I bevel up the edges, punch a hole through it, and it's basically ready to serve its purpose. I position it nicely, give it a black glossy texture, and then cut it up into thirds, partitioning it nicely. I try to use the same method to cut the center shelf, but eventually decide against it, building the shelf using a separate object instead. I give it the same texture and scoot it nicely into place. When that is looking just the way I want it, I turn my attention to creating a rug, starting by placing a subdivided plane on the ground. I find myself a fabric-like texture map, one that's suitable for this purpose, and begin to tweak its color to make it more even. Then, since there is a bit of perspective distortion, I cut away some part of the texture following the lines on the image. When that is done on both sides, I use the perspective transformation tool to stretch out the image, so that now the perspective looks just like the picture was taken from a perfect top-down angle. That's what we'll need for texture mapping. Now, this simple straw color is a little boring. I would prefer some sort of pattern myself, and hence, in a new image, I start off with a white background and draw a simple pattern on top. I repeatedly make use of the mirror tool to ensure that all my lines are perfectly equal. I layer several sets of bars on top of each other, ensuring that I've set up the blending mode so that the colors could interact. Then I tile it so that it matches the size of the rug texture and superimpose the two images together. I set the blending mode to overlay and begin tweaking the colors of the two layers so that they were incorporated nicely. Returning to Blender, I apply that image onto the rug, switching on rendering of the texture and tweaking the scale of the image, which gives me control over exactly how many times the pattern tiles on the rug. Now, this room is a studio after all, so it's time to bring in some equipment. Luckily, we have equipment already from the green room, so all that needs to be done is to duplicate them and place them nicely in the scene. I spend a little bit of time organizing and naming my meshes, and then I begin to bring in some of the lights as well. It takes some time to get the lights positioned right, since they did actually cast some light, so I had to continuously re-render the scene to make sure everything still looked okay. There was also a little bit of trouble when it comes to positioning the second light, since it would be in the way of the door. When I've gotten that figured out, I decided that the next line of attack is wallpaper. To that end, I've gotten myself a very nice brick texture map. Now, there are some weird colors in the image I wasn't very sure about, so in GIMP, I took some time to paint that stuff out, using mostly the clone feature. With that done, I tried several ways to make the image look more seamless, eventually opting for the gmig method. Back in Blender, I simply texture the wallpaper onto the room walls. Due to some weirdness with the room mesh, I wind up having to texture each wall separately, but when that's done, Look at what a huge difference that makes. Anyway, once I was done admiring that, I began to build a game console under the TV. Now, I haven't seen a physical console in ages, so I just went for an approximate shape. I carved out something that looks vaguely passable and then gave it a disc slot and power button, the kind with a light around the edge. Once that's done, naturally the next thing to build is a controller. While I have seen one of those in recent history, it's not very easy to model. I used a box modeling and subdivision kind of technique, ending up with a somewhat passable shape. Then I add cylinders, which will act as the base of analog controls. Then I built the two knobs from an extruded sphere using subdivision to make it look smoother. After that, I began to build the buttons from simple flattened spheres. To build the D-pad, I used a proportional editing tool to lengthen the 4 buttons inwards. After some final tweaks, I have a controller that doesn't look too bad. I give it some colors and it's basically ready for deployment. Since our scale figures are just sitting around, I put the controllers in their laps to get a good idea of their scale. Then I place the controllers on the table, wrapping up this part. Just to give the room a bit more of a homey feel, I found several nice images for use in the background. It takes a while to decide how I wanted to post-process the images, but I eventually settled for tone mapping, which makes the colors of the image look more painterly. Then, with an oil painting filter on top of it to seal the effect. I repeat the exact same steps for the second image. When done, I moved back to Blender and copied one of the notice boards over from the cubicle room. This will act as the frame of our image. I replaced the cork with the textures that have just been created. After testing a few settings, I eventually opt to leave a small gap around the paintings, giving them a small white border, which seems to make the effect feel more natural. As I begin to wrap up by preparing for a render, I noticed something strange. There are weird black shadows on the surface of the sofa. I couldn't figure out what was wrong for the longest time, and tried tweaking lights and materials to no avail. Eventually, however, I noticed the problem. The mirror modifier and the badly scaled meshes caused some surfaces to intersect with others. This was in fact an issue of Z fighting. Tweaking the meshes so that they wouldn't overlap fixed the issue instantly. With that problem solved, I began to render the scene. In fact, since I really liked how this turned out, you're gonna get quite a few different renders. And there you go. It looks pretty good if I may say so myself. It feels very vibrant, very alive, just like how, you want a real set to be. I think the wallpaper really sells the effect. So yeah, with this particular room concluded, next time we can turn our attention elsewhere. Since I have been working on quite a few things that are smaller, the high detail stuff, like the pens in a cubicle room and the controller, why not, let's go back to the pantry next time and sort of finish up all the things I said I would leave till later. So that might be what we do for the next episode, but that's all there is for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, you're watching 0612 TV. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, consider checking out the rest of my work on my channel. Alternatively, you may be interested in the last season of Speed Model. If you'd like to show me some monetary support, I am on Patreon. You can find a link to my campaign in the video description. Of course, you can simply like this video or leave a comment. I'll be sure to respond as soon as I can. To keep in touch with my future uploads, do subscribe to this channel. And for even more updates, check out the official Twitter account for this channel at 0612TV. Thank you for your support.